everyone. I am not Barbara Peters. My name is Karen Odden. I'm a local author here in town in Scottsdale, and it's my pleasure today to be in conversation with Eric. He is going to have a slideshow that we're going to begin with, and then afterwards we'll have time for some questions and answers. And this book was a true joy for me to read. I happen to like maritime history and fiction. This sort of felt like a cross between Master and Commander and Robinson Crusoe. So, and Eric lives in Massachusetts and has published 16 books, many of them about the sea. So I'm really looking forward to this slide presentation because I like slides. So,
great, thanks. I'm going to stand. Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Barbara for inviting me, and thanks to all of you. I understand there are millions of people watching right now, so I'm really happy about that. But anyway, Left for Dead is a true story of a wild and fateful encounter between an American sealing vessel, a shipwrecked British brig, and a British warship in the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. Fraught with misunderstanding and mistrust, the incident left 3 British sailors and 2 Americans marooned on the Falkland Islands for nearly a year and a half. And one of the Americans that was marooned was Charles H. Barnard, the captain of the American sealing vessel. It's a tale involving British and Americans meeting under the most stressful circumstances in a time of war. Kindness and compassion, drunkenness, the birth of a child, treachery, greed, lying, a hostile takeover, stellar leadership, ingenuity, severe privation, the great value of a good dog, perseverance, endurance, threats, bullying, banishment, a perilous 1,000-mile open ocean journey in a 17.5-foot boat, an improbable rescue mission in a rickety ship, and legal battles over a dubious and disgraceful wartime prize. And yes, that is actually a sentence in the book. Fortunately for readers, that is one of the longest sentences in the book. And my wife, who reviews all of my books before they go to the publisher, earlier when she did that, she named herself the Kamikaze because I use so many commas in my book, but I've gotten over that. Anyway, the centerpiece for the book is the cold and extremely windy Falkland Islands. During the winter months, the average temperature in the Falklands is 36 degrees, and during the summer, it's only 49 degrees. But the kicker is the average wind speed in the Falklands is 18 miles per hour, so that makes it a lot colder. So it's considerably colder than Scottsdale is today at 115. It's a sprawling archipelago of more than 700 islands, located roughly 300 miles from the coast of Argentina. The Falklands have a stark beauty. The rugged landscape is undeniably spectacular. And if you could see this image a little bit closer, all of that white stuff is actually guano from black-browed albatrosses who nest in the Falklands. It's the single largest nesting area in the world for that bird. This is a settlement rookery in a storm. And this image is one of my favorite images in the book. It gives you a real sense of the alien nature of the Falklands, really a very different place. The flora, such as this sea cabbage and this wild celery, and the fauna is also striking. But the most important animals with regards to Left for Dead are the seals, the fur seals and the sea lions. Barnard and his crew of 12 men, along with his trusty dog Scent, left New York Harbor and headed to the Falklands on the 73-foot-long brig Nanina on April 12, 1812, hoping to strike it rich by gathering a hold full of sealskins, which could be sold in China. Now, to give you a sense of how large this industry was at the time, in the late 1700s to the early 1800s, about 2.5 million to 3.5 million seals were slaughtered in the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, and they were sold mainly in China for between 35 cents and $5 a piece. So it was a fairly sizable industry. But it wasn't only seal skins that they were after. They also planned to kill sea elephants and strip them of their blubber, melt it down to create an illuminant that was second only to sperm whale oil in terms of its price and its ability to give off smokeless light, or relatively smokeless light. The Nanina arrived in New Island on the western edge of the uninhabited Falklands on September 7th of 1812 and moored in Hooker's Harbor. This is one of the 3 maps that I had commissioned for this book. Barnard took a great chance leaving New York on the eve of the increasingly likely war between the United States and Great Britain. And on January 3rd of 1813, his plans were upended when the American sealer Hope arrived in the Falklands and informed Barnard and the rest of them that the war had broken out the previous June. The contract that Barnard had signed with the owners of the Nanina required him to return immediately to the nearest United States port should war break out. But they decided to do something else. They decided to stay in the Falklands for another year and continue sealing in the hope that at the end of that year the war would be over and they could go home unmolested. But they couldn't stay at New Island because it was frequented by British ships and they might be taken as a prize. So they decided they had to sail. They went all the way from New Island, which is up there, all the way over here to Barnard's Harbor. And as you can tell, Barnard was kind of an arrogant guy, and when he did one of the first maps of the Falklands, he named a bunch of areas in the Falklands after himself. They continued sailing and assumed that they were the only people on the islands. But in April, they discovered that they were not alone. Months earlier, on December 4th of 1812, the 193-ton brig Isabella sailed from Port Jackson Harbor in the British penal colony of New South Wales, which you know as Australia. The brig's destination was London via Cape Horn. In addition to a cargo of sealskins, whale oil, and mother-of-pearl shells, the Isabella had 54 people on board, including 34 passengers. 14 of them were armed British Royal Marines, and 10 of them were pardoned convicts, or ones who had served out their time, and that included 4 former female prostitutes who play an important role in the book. After nearly crashing, and that's important because my mother, who lives here in Arizona, is 91. Every time I write a book, she says one thing: Eric, put some sex in it. And none of my books have much sex in it, and this one really only has a little bit, but at least I went a little bit towards that direction. Anyway, after nearly crashing into an island south of New Zealand and barely surviving a tempestuous sail around Cape Horn, on February 8th, the Isabella crashed onto a reef just off Eagle Island, which was part of the Falkland Islands, and finally came to rest on a rock ledge just feet from the shore. And the reason that they had such trouble going around Cape Horn and almost crashing south of New Zealand and then crashing in the Falklands is because the captain, George Higdon, was a drunkard. And he was in his cabin with one of the female prostitutes instead of sailing the ship. Now this is Eagle Island right down here. You see, they're up here, the Nanina. There's New Island. Here's Eagle Island. This island is about 7 miles long, about 3 miles wide. It is owned by Chris and Lindsay May today, who helped me with the book. They provided some images and some information. They live there entirely alone, with the exception of 60,000 sheep. And their son lives in a neighboring island, but he's a real piker when it comes to sheep because he only owns 30,000 sheep. And given that there are only about 5,500 people in the Falklands, sheep greatly outnumber humans. Now, miraculously, all of the people on board the Isabella made it safely to the beach. And in the ensuing days, they offloaded most of the cargo and created a makeshift settlement. This anchor is bigger than it appears. It's about 12 feet from top to bottom, and if it had both flukes, it'd be about 7 feet wide. A few weeks later, the survivors sent off 6 men in a 17.5-foot boat that was retrieved from the crashed Isabella. After a dramatic voyage of 1,200 miles, they made it all the way from the Falklands up to Buenos Aires, where there was a British warship on station. There they met with the captain of the HMS Nereus, a guy named Peter Haywood, who was a survivor of the infamous mutiny on the Bounty. He immediately launched a rescue mission. He sent a guy named Captain William Peter Duranda, who was the captain of the HMS Nancy, to the Falklands to rescue the stranded passengers of the Isabella. But in the meantime, about a month or so had passed, a little bit more than a month, and the situation back on the Falklands had taken a dramatic turn. In early April of 1813, Barnard and a few of his men took the Nanina's shallop, the young Nanina, on a sealing trip to Fox Bay on the eastern side of western Falkland Islands. So they were up here, and they saw smoke rising from Eagle Island, which they knew was uninhabited. So they went to investigate, and they came upon the castaways of the Isabella. Now, despite the fact that the Americans and Great Britain were at war, Barnard and the Americans decided to do the right thing, the humanitarian thing, the noble thing. They offered to save all of the British castaways, bring them to South America where they could catch a boat, hopefully to London, despite the fact that there was a war going on. The only thing in exchange that Barnard required was that the Americans, who were foregoing a chance to make more money from sealing to save these castaways, he said, the only thing that I need is rights to the cargo of the Isabella and salvage rights to the ship itself, minus personal effects. They all agreed, but Barnard discovered that the British didn't know the war had begun. So he decided that they needed to be informed about this before they took off, because if they found out later, they might think that they were hoodwinked. And they so greatly outnumbered the Americans that that could be dangerous. So they told the British that the war had begun, and they took another vote, and the British still agreed that what the Americans were offering was a very nice deal, so they took it. Leaving some of his men behind on Eagle Island, Barnard and about 22 of the British went all the way back to where the Nanina was moored. And on May 3rd, 1813, the young Nanina was reunited with the Nanina. And then Barnard, along with all the men, prepared the Nanina, putting up its rigging and sails, to go back to Eagle Island and save the castaways. But at that very moment, Commander Duranda arrived at Eagle Island. He had no idea there were Americans there. His arrival dramatically altered the Americans' and the Britons' plans. Duranda immediately tossed aside the agreement that had been made between the Americans and the British. He didn't care if they did the right thing. He wanted the Nanina to be a prize of war, and he wanted all of the Americans to be prisoners of war. Not a single person of the castaways, who formerly were so thankful for what the Americans had done, not a single one of them stood up to argue with Duranda. But first to come back to Eagle Island was the young Nanina, the shallop. It arrived on May 16th and was promptly declared a prize, and the Americans on board became prisoners of war. The days turned into weeks, and Duranda started to worry because of the bad weather that his big prize, the Nanina, had foundered, and he had lost everything. Well, the ship hadn't crashed or foundered, but something very troubling had occurred. The atrocious weather and the adverse winds kept the Nanina from heading to Eagle Island for weeks on end, and instead forced Barnard to pull into New Island, anchoring in Coffin Harbor right here, Ship Harbor. On June 3rd, with the storm showing no sign of abating, Barnard came to a decision. He thought it was foolhardy to continue to Eagle Island. The weather was too bad. So he went to talk to Captain Robert Dury, this gentleman, to tell him of his idea to hold up on New Island for a couple of weeks until the weather changes and then go to Eagle Island. And remember, Captain Robert Dury is in charge of the Royal Marines. Now, Dury has some descendants, and they actually helped me a little bit with this book. They gave me this image, and they know what you're going to find out soon is that Captain Robert Dury doesn't come off too well in this book. So one of his descendants wrote to me and said, well, I hope you go easy on my ancestor. I don't know if they've read the book yet, but I didn't go particularly easy on him. But the other thing I learned is when he gets back to England later, he gets an aristocratic title. So I asked this guy, his descendant, I said, so do you have a lot of land or money? I didn't put it quite that way. He goes, no, he left us with nothing. So that was funny. So they're getting ready. Dury agreed that was a prudent course. They presented that plan to hold up for a while to all of the British. They voted. They said, great, let's do it. And they decided the weather was so bad that they had to come out of Ship Harbor, which is a little too exposed, and they went into Hooker's Harbor, and they put out 3 anchors to keep them from being sent into the shore. About a week later, during a break in the weather, Charles proposed using the boat of the Nanina, a small jolly boat, to go to a neighboring island to kill some hogs and some birds so that all the people that were with the Nanina, who were fast running out of food, wouldn't starve. So here's the second humanitarian gesture on the part of the Americans. Right after he proposed this hunting trip, all of the British rushed forward and demanded that the Nanina leave right away and go to Eagle Island. Forget about the hunting trip. Barnard calmed them down. He said, I'll only be gone a couple of days. We need food. This is the right thing to do. He believed things were under control. Barnard asked for some volunteers. 1 American volunteered and 3 British. They went off on the jolly boat on June 11th to Beaver Island, which is right here, which has, incidentally, there are no beavers on Beaver Island. I'm not sure. There's some problems with naming down in the Falklands. But anyway, that was Beaver Island, and they left on June 11th. On June 13th, just about 2 days later, the British renewed their demand to leave immediately and go to Eagle Island. Well, one of the people on board the Nanina was a guy named Valentine Barnard, who happened to be Charles Barnard's father, 63-year-old father. And you'll have to read the book to find out why such an old man who had 2 hernias and was being kept together by multiple trusses was on such a dangerous and long voyage. Well, he spoke up and he protested the move of going directly to Eagle Island. He said, listen, let's just wait a couple of days. The hunting party will come back and then we'll go. The British wouldn't have it. They stood fast. Growing more alarmed, Valentine appealed to Captain Dury, who was in charge of the Royal Marines. And instead of listening to what Valentine had to say, he sided with the other British. And he said he had no objection to the brig proceeding right away. Valentine was shocked by this answer. And he said, your Marines are under your charge, and I demand of you assistance. And if you do not assist me, I conclude that you take charge and you shall be accountable for whatever happens. And you think that's a convincing speech. Well, unfortunately for Valentine and the missing men, Captain Robert Dury lacked a spine of steel. He ignored Valentine's plea, and over the continued objections of the Americans, they prepared the Nanina to take off. But one of the Americans knew something. He knew that none of the British were familiar with the treacherous waters of the Falkland Islands. So he offered to sail the Nanina to Eagle Island in exchange for the Nanina stopping at Beaver Island to pick up the hunting party. They agreed. That sounded good. But when the Nanina drew abreast of Beaver Island, what did the British do? It was horrible British. Anyway, they reneged on their deal. They refused to send in a boat or even come to a stop. They just fired a gun twice and then sailed off. Valentine pleaded with the British to do more, realizing that he was leaving his son and the others behind. He made it clear to them that to leave the crew on this island in the depth of a dreadfully severe winter without food, raiment, or shelter was the equivalent of a death sentence. Unmoved, the British sailed off. When the Nanina arrived at Eagle Island, Duranda claimed it as a prize and claimed all the Americans as prisoners of war. This is the northern end of Eagle Island. And keep in mind, with 60,000 sheep, they keep it closely cropped. So it looked a little more lush in the early 1800s. Now, the most plausible explanation for why Duranda decided to take the Nanina in that manner is that he wanted to claim a prize of war and get the glory that would come from that, and also the money that would come from that, because it was determined in London that it was a valid prize of war. He would be able to sell the Nanina and get the proceeds of the sale of the Nanina and all of the cargo and split it with the men on the ship. So in the coming weeks, the Americans begged Duranda to send a search party to retrieve the hunting party. Remember, they're over here, Beaver Island's way up there. Well, Duranda kept refusing to send a search party. After a couple of weeks, he finally relented. He sent 3 men, none of whom had any real familiarity with the Falkland Islands, on a trip. And instead of going all the way to Beaver Island, where the hunting party was, they just went right across Falkland Island Sound to Fox Bay and then came back, of course, with nobody. On July 27th, exactly 170 days after the Isabella slammed ashore, and 44 days since the hunting party was left behind, the Nanina and the Nancy left the Falkland Islands. The passengers and crew of the 2 vessels could only imagine what had happened to the hunting party. But what they imagined almost certainly was not as dramatic as what actually occurred. The hunt on Beaver Island had gone well. They killed a couple of hogs, which species we're not sure, and a bunch of geese, and they threw them in the jolly boat, and they went back to New Island, and they were greeted with an alarming sight. The Nanina was gone. A frantic search at dawn turned up nothing. Refusing to believe that he and the other men had been barbarously deserted, Barnard seized on one other explanation. The Nanina must have gone back to Beaver Island, but it went to the opposite side of the island from where the hunters were hunting. So they pushed the jolly boat back into the water, went back to Beaver Island, and hopefully they were going to find the Nanina there. Upon entering the harbor, as Barnard later recalled, they experienced the almost insupportable anguish of neither finding the brig nor discovering any trace that she had been there. They had been cruelly abandoned at the beginning of a Falklands winter, with little to sustain them and no explanation of why they'd been left in such a horrible predicament. On June 15th, they latched onto one final idea. Remember, here's Eagle Island, here's where that's where the Nanina was, and here's where the men were on Beaver Island. They decided they were going to sail all the way to Eagle Island and hopefully catch the Nanina before it left. Well, it was the middle of winter, it was bad weather, they got lost. So instead of going down here, they wanted to go right here to Fagan's Inlet, hike over here, and then come out here and sail over here. Instead, they ended up going all the way up here, getting lost, and they came back to Swan Island. They were tired. They tried one more time. They got lost again. They were emaciated. They went back to Swan Island, and they decided, well, we're not going to make it to Eagle Island. So, they established a rudimentary plant, a rudimentary camp. After the Nancy and the Nanina left Eagle Island, they split up. The Nancy headed to Buenos Aires, and then Duranda made his way to Rio de Janeiro, where the Nanina was waiting for him. In Rio, Rear Admiral Sir Manly Dixon, I always thought that was a great name for a Rear Admiral, Manly Dixon, met with Duranda and the Americans, and he was outraged. He thought that the way the Americans were treated was outrageous. The Nanina shouldn't have been claimed as a prize. The Americans shouldn't have been made prisoners of war, and he was particularly outraged by leaving behind the hunting party. So he wanted to make a deal with Valentine Bernard to get him the Nanina back, minus the Isabella's cargo. They haggled for about a day or two. They couldn't come to agreement. Finally, Manly Dixon got so upset, he threw up his hands and he said, "That's it. I'm sending the Nanina to London, where a prize court can determine who has the rights to this ship." Now, while Valentine was still negotiating with Dixon, the other Americans made their way back home on various vessels, and they had with them a copy of a protest they wrote in Rio de Janeiro, which described everything that happened on the Falklands. When they got back to America, that protest was published in dozens of newspapers across the United States, and it was prefaced by a short paragraph under the title of British Inhumanity. And because I really like the paragraph, I'm going to read it to you. "We request the attention of the reader to the following account of the almost unparalleled ingratitude and treachery of the crew of a British ship to the crew of an American vessel, the latter having saved the lives of the former, whose vessel had been wrecked, and they, in return for this humane act, seized and made prize of the vessel and property of their preservers. Were it not that such a nation as Britain existed, this act of treachery might be correctly styled unparalleled. But British history is full of incidents of such black ingratitude." So I'm sorry if any of you here or in the listening audience are British. But any country has a lot to be unhappy about in their own history. But anyway, such conduct, even in our enemy, cannot fail to call forth the indignant feelings of every American who has a drop of patriotic blood flowing in his veins. Now, when the owners of the Nanina found out what had happened, they were limited in what they could do. The war was still going on. They couldn't send a rescue mission. They couldn't go to London to argue their side of the case. And of course, none of the Americans, including Barnard's family and the other families of the men, had any idea what happened to the hunting party. If they had known, they would have been amazed and impressed. The hunting party, this is an engraving from 1829, by the way. The hunting party survived on their own for 534 days, most of it living on New Island. They made clothes and shoes out of seal skins, subsisted mainly on a diet of hogs, geese, seals, native plants, potatoes, and albatross and penguin eggs. And fortunately for them, it's funny, I was reading an article today about cholesterol. Fortunately for them, in the early 1800s, nobody was concerned about cholesterol because these guys ate like dozens of these big eggs a day. Anyway, they built a rudimentary hut out of sod, driftwood, sealskins, and the ribs of whales. And this engraving, I don't know why Captain Bernard is there lurking behind the tussock grass, but he looks vaguely suspicious. Now, to cook and stay warm, they burned vines, driftwood, and peat underlying the dense growths of tussock grass. This grass can grow to be 9 feet long, 9 feet high, and live for 200 years, and burns beautifully when you dig up the high organic content peat. Now, during this long period, they got into a few fights. They had many adventures and misadventures, and they faced much adversity. They went on numerous hunts with Barnard's dog, Scent, taking the lead. I don't know what kind of breed he was, but he was a very hardy dog. And he was gravely injured in many battles with hogs, because hogs, as you know, have these modified canine teeth that are really tusks. And at one point, poor Scent had his groin gored, and then another time he had one of his eyes popped out, but he still continued the hunt. At one point, believe it or not, the other men, 4 of the men, abandoned Charles Bernard. They took his dog, they took everything and the boat, and left him for 2 months and made him a real Robinson Crusoe. And then they returned after 2 months with, no pun intended, their tail between their legs. I guess Scent had his tail between his legs. And they begged to be taken back, and Barnard was a religious man, and he decided to turn the other cheek and took them back. And but later on, one of the troublemakers, the British guys, they marooned him on another island. So this is like Peyton Place. I mean, this is really interesting stuff going on. Now, one of the men's most exciting and dangerous adventures was when they went to the southwestern end of New Island to a cliff that was 200 feet high. This engraving doesn't get it correct. The cliff didn't bow in. It sort of went in that direction so they could use their feet as they came down. But that rope is made from very old sea lion skins that have been peeled like you peel an apple in one core, and then they ravel together a bunch of skins, let them dry for 2 or 3 days, and it makes a very strong leather. The Inuits and the natives of North America have been doing that for thousands of years. So they actually went down this cliff, they killed a bunch of seals, and they brought them back up. Now, we're getting close to the end. The men's lonely and harsh existence ended on November 15th of 1814, when the British whaling ships, the Asp and the Indispensable, arrived in the Falklands. The 2 ships departed the Falkland Islands with the survivors on November 29th, 1814. And in an amazing coincidence, that is the very day that thousands of miles away, the fate of the Nina was being determined by a British court. The prize case appeared to be quite simple. Duranda submitted his side of the story, and no one was there to dispute it. So the court ruled that the prize was his, as long as nobody came along for an entire year. There was a year appeal period. So Duranda said, well, I just have to wait a year, and the money will be mine. Now, after the war ended and peace made it possible for John Murray and Sons, John Murray, the owner of the Nina, to go to London, he did. And he ended up getting there by June of 1815. He launched a legal attack, and as a result, the Advocate General of the Civil Court urged Murray to appeal instantly the condemnation of the Nina, stating that there is reason to think that the capture ought not to have been made. Appeal Murray did, his barrister or lawyer, submitting the paperwork on November 28th, 1815, exactly 1 day before the 1-year appeal period would have run out. I didn't make any of this up. It's just, wow, that's why when I start the book, it's appropriate that I'm in a store where most of what they sell is nonfiction, is fiction, because when I was, this story, it reads like fiction. It's almost impossible to believe. Now, finally, on February 5th of 1818, the Prize Appeal Court ruled in favor of John Murray, and Duranda, Captain Duranda, was left with nothing. Murray was paid for the value of the Nina and all the cargo, and for the rest of his life, Duranda complained. He had a very sad life. Barnard's journey back home was long and fascinating. It included stops in Lima, the Sandwich Islands, or what you know as Hawaii, and Canton, plus many other adventures. Finally, at the end of October 1816, he arrived back in South Street Seaport in New York, amazing his family and the owners of the Nina, who had no idea what had happened for all this time. Now, I tell you, I gave a talk about a month and a half ago at the South Street Seaport at the museum on one of their boats. And I don't think Barbara's here anymore, but at this talk, they served alcohol. They had an open bar. And that could be very dangerous. One of the women in the audience got so drunk, she had to be escorted off the vessel in the middle of my talk. She was wobbling around. So anyway, hopefully she liked what she heard. And I'll tell you that this is not what the seaport looks like now. In fact, I had a $6.50 latte and sushi right here. So it's very different from what it was in the early 1800s. Now, the rest of Barnard's life was not particularly noteworthy and included stints as a warden of the Port of New York and as a commander of a light ship stationed off Sandy Hook, New Jersey. He also went back to the Falklands, believe it or not, on another sealing voyage in the South Shetland Islands. After encouragement from his friends, he finally wrote this book in 1829 about his experiences. When he died on November 13th, 1863, he was 83 years old, quite an advanced age at the time. Few newspapers covered his passing, but one that did was the New York Herald, and it published an announcement that was only one sentence long, and it said nothing about his time in the Falklands, probably the most important single event in his life. So his life ended as it had begun in relative obscurity. But I have to add that another very famous person, Herman Melville, who I wrote about in my book on whaling, Leviathan, when he died in 1891, he only got a one-sentence obituary in Harper's Monthly magazine. So I remember when I used to give talks on that book, especially in New England, I would say, okay, when I die, my local paper, the Marblehead Reporter in Massachusetts, better give me an obituary of at least one paragraph. Unfortunately, the way that newspapers have gone, the Marblehead Reporter is defunct. There's another newspaper there now, so we'll see. Hopefully I'm not kicking the bucket anytime soon, but maybe I'll get a paragraph, maybe. Anyway, this is on New Island today, which is now a nature preserve, and that's the Captain Charles H. Bernard Museum, which, when I mentioned this about a month ago at a talk, a guy in the audience, I told him it's a museum. He goes, no, it isn't. I said, what do you mean? He goes, I was in the Falklands on February. I went in that building. They're selling postcards, a souvenir shop. So I said, well, they pulled the wool over my eyes because the Falklands Tourism Office and a woman who lives there and takes care of the island sent me 12 pictures of the inside of that building, and it looked like a museum to me. The only thing I could figure is in the summer months in the Falklands, when cruise ships, eco cruise ships come by, they push all the museum stuff to the side and they load it up with t-shirts or something else. But I haven't been there. That's a question I always get asked. I did not go to the Falklands because it's quite a long trip, and I didn't think I had to go to the Falklands to make the Falklands a real character in the book. And I will tell you that I think I succeeded, not based on my commentary, but one of the people that blurbed the book is a guy named Menson Bound. If you follow the news this past summer, you know that Ernest Shackleton's boat, the Endeavor, the Endurance, was discovered. He headed up that expedition, and he wrote a blurb for this book, and he also wrote me an email saying very nice things about how I described the Falklands, because he grew up on New Island. So, but I did tell the people of Falklands. I was on the Falklands TV a couple of weeks ago. I think 5 people were probably watching. And I said, if this book sells enough copies, Jen and I, my wife, will go to the Falklands. So far, I'm not sure we're going to make it. So all those of you watching at home, if you want to help me go to the Falklands, buy a copy of the book. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and we can just go into talking or whatever you would like at this point.
How did you find out about this story at the beginning?
That's always tough. As I said, this is my 16th book. Most of the books, my ideas come from the book I'm working on right presently. For this book, I just finished a book called Rebels at Sea, which is about privateering in the American Revolution. I had no idea what my next book topic would be. So I remembered there was a book that was written in the 1970s, and it's a compilation of marine disasters up to 1860. And for each disaster, there's a 1 or 2 paragraph description. and then some primary sources beneath that. So I started flipping through it, and I realized, oh, I know that disaster, I know that disaster, I know that disaster. And then I came upon this paragraph that talked about this guy, Charles Bernard, being marooned in the Falkland Islands. I said, hey, that's interesting. And I had written about sealing before in my fur trade book, Fur, Fortune, and Empire. So I started reading, I read his book, I read other stuff, and then I finally decided there was enough to write a book. So that's how I came up with the idea. I'm currently writing a book about another shipwreck. This one's in the Pacific Ocean. It's very different circumstances. It's about 2 decades later. It involves a whaling ship, so I'm going back to my earlier history. But this one has a lot of people die, and people are tattooed, and they're starved to death, all sorts of exciting stuff. But unfortunately for my mother, there's no sex. So I'll never hit the big time because my books don't have sex.
Prostitutes factor in, other than they were having it off with the captain.
Yeah, that's probably the main way they factoring in, having it with the captain. But they also struck up relationships with some other people. But again, if my mother ever reads the book, she'll be disappointed.
So in addition to to Barnard's book, which
Yes.
I'm sure was a really significant
Oh,
source
yeah.
for you,
Yep.
what were some of the other sources that you used?
Well, there were a bunch of newspaper articles written at the time. There was the protest that the people who came back with the Nanina when they left behind the hunting party. That was about a 20-some-odd page protest, which detailed everything that had happened. There were 4 logbooks, 2 from the British, 2 from the Americans. There were also some accounts that were written by some of the British a couple of years after the event. They wrote their memoirs. One guy, this Lieutenant London, who was a British guy, wrote an article for the Edinburgh Review in 1846. And it was like 25-page article, really dense, and it really had a lot of details about what happened. So all of those things together gave me enough information to write this book. And this book is so different from my other books. Most of my books have 10, 11, 12 chapters. This book has 40 chapters. It reads much more like fiction. It's very fast-paced. And maybe as I'm getting older and I have less of an attention span, I want to write books that, you could read one chapter and then fall asleep. I think that's what I'm aiming for.
Well, there are so many events, and I found myself just kind of like flying through it, and I would and I'd get to like the beginning of a chapter very quickly,
Yes.
because I was churning through it. One of the things that I found really interesting about this was when you begin the book, one of the things you point out is that this is something that happens on the Falkland Islands, which
Right.
is right off Argentina.
Right.
But it is in great part caused by the Napoleonic Wars
Right.
and the greed in China for these seals. I mean, and,
Right.
and the Napoleonic War thing, I thought that was fascinating. The
Yeah.
idea that during the wars, the British could seize the American ships. The French could seize
Right.
the American ships. They could also impress Americans into service.
Right.
And the Royal Navy, I love there's a line in your book that says something like, well, they did it because they had to, because they needed people. And
Yeah.
as if that's the logic. And
That's their logic.
That's their logic. They thought it made sense to them. But what was curious is that caused a situation where the mariners, where the people were keeping their ships home, and the mariners were staying home because they didn't want to get impressed and they didn't want the ships. So this creates this workforce, like
Right.
a bubble.
Right.
Almost like all of these, skilled, talented mariners who know what they're doing, and they have nothing to do. They have no work.
Right.
And so all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, let's go sealing.
Right.
And
But also it created without the war, I mean,
Right.
it precipitated the War of 1812. Without the War of 1812, obviously there would have been no book. Without so many individual things, if the British had just done the right thing, there would have been no book. I mean, it would have been boring. I said, oh, the Americans saved them, they went back
Right,
home,
and
and nothing exciting. So I'm glad the British were not ethical. Yeah, we're not bad. And it's really funny, the ethical part. I mean, I obviously thought about that when I was writing, but just 2 days ago, I saw, as all writers do, I'm sure you do it. I will say I do this, and don't think less of me. But I have a tracker, my name. So if any article ever shows up with my name, I get an email or something. And the other day I got an email, the San Diego newspaper, a rabbi out there wrote an entire article about my book, but he used it. It was a great review of the book. But then most of the article was using the Bible. He was basically talking about the ethics of leaving people behind, being good to your fellow man. And he drew all these lessons about the Bible, and he compared things that happened in my book to things that, what does the Bible tell us about that? I've never had a review like that before. That was wild. But there are ethical questions that are involved in this. Another thing that's been brought up a lot that I didn't think about at all when I was writing this book, a bunch of people have come to my earlier talks, and especially radio people that have interviewed me, they said, this reminds me of my workplace, backstabbing, people not being straightforward with each other, duplicity. I said, oh, I never thought about that.
Well, it's interesting because it's in some ways kind of like a locked room mystery. You've
Yeah.
got sort of 5 people, and I have to say that I was very impressed with Bernard for constantly forgiving this guy.
Right.
What was his name? Ansel.
Ansel, Samuel
Oh
Ansel.
my God, he
was horrible.
He was terrible. I mean, he was just so awful, and yet, and he keeps giving him one more chance. I'm like, nobody, you've got to do some tough love here. And but I guess one of the things that I wanted to point out about the beginning of the book is you suggest, I mean, it's happening on this tiny, tiny little space, but it has all of these connections that are global,
Yeah.
and that have to do with what's going on, thousands and thousands of miles away, that is
Right.
creating this possibility in this situation, this very peculiar situation.
Yeah.
And then you get real life almost in miniature. You have childbirth, and you have feuds, and you have jealousy, and all of those.
Yeah.
It's a drama, a very small drama. With
Oh,
5
yeah, no,
characters. And a
it's-
dog. And
it's
the dog
a
was
dog.
left, didn't it? The dog
Oh,
was one of my
people love the
favorites.
dog.
Love
Without the dog, people
Yeah.
love the dog. In fact, people love dogs so much. I remember once, years ago, I wrote, I don't remember which book it was, a radio guy was interviewing me, and after the interview was over, he asked me what my next book was. And that book in particular was one of my books that didn't do as well as my other books. So I was a little discouraged, and I said, people love dogs and puppies. I'm going to write a book about puppies. And he looked at me, he goes, if you write a book about puppies, I'm not interviewing you. But he got fired about a year later, so maybe it doesn't matter. But no, people love the dog story. People love dogs. I mean, dogs are great.
The dog is...
He's a major character.
He's a major character.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
He is fierce.
Yes.
He is loyal.
Yep.
He throws himself into the fray over and over again.
If he hadn't been there, this
I think they would've died.
situation it would have been different.
Yeah. They would have been hungry.
They would have been more. They were hungry. Yes, that's
Yeah.
true. But yeah, it was a wild story. That's what captured my attention. But all history books are basically stories about the ones that are most interesting about humans and human interactions and what they do under trying circumstances or in good times as well. So it was fun, and it got me to go back, and there were some themes that I've written about before. I've written about the War of 1812 before. I've written about sealing before. I've obviously written a lot about ships, sailing before. So there were a lot of things that were familiar to me, but I also learned a lot in writing the book. So.
What was the most surprising thing that you learned from researching?
This is a cop-out answer because I've been asked that a lot. The most surprising thing was almost everything. I have, just to give you a little bit more of my background, I have an undergraduate, master's, and PhD all in biology and environmental policy. I am not a trained historian. I came to writing this kind of stuff later in life just because I love it. And so each time I write a book, it's like getting a master's degree. And since I knew nothing about this story, everything was surprising. But the thing that captured my attention most when I was writing it, the thing that was most fun was the duplicity, was when that's why people love murder mysteries. It's the most horrible thing that a human can do to another human being, yet people are reading these murder mysteries all the time. It's why people watch 2020 or these murder shows at night. I mean, it's really horrible. What does it say about us as a human species that our best-selling books are about murderous people? And I have to tell you, when you read about people getting killed or doing bad things, it energizes your writing. The book I'm working on right now, when people get killed and bad things happen, it's fun writing about that stuff. And I feel horrible.
Yes, I know, but in this book, as within most mysteries, the closure is the reestablishment of order.
Right.
And I was so happy, I have to say, when Deronda got his. Because
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was another bad character. And he comes out, crawling with his tail between his legs, like, I didn't get any money. But I think that the restoration of order
Yeah.
is so pleasing in this book because there's all different kinds of order that
Right.
get sort of reestablished. I mean, and not to mention that all 5 of them do live.
Yeah.
Sorry for the spoiler.
They do. Oh no, don't worry about it. You just heard a summary of the book, and my wife would always tell me, because every time I give book talks, I give a summary of the book. Fiction. I'm jealous of fiction authors because when I've gone to a few fiction book talks, all they have to do is read a chapter and answer a bunch of questions. They don't have to tell the whole story. I tell the story just because it's the only way I can think about it. I don't know how to tell you a piece of it to get you interested. And Jennifer's always telling me, you can't tell them the whole story because they won't buy the book. And I will tell you, there have been more than a dozen people over the years who have come up to me afterwards and said, you did such a great talk, I don't have to buy the book. But I guarantee you haven't gotten the whole book by just listening to me for 30 minutes. But it is funny.
How long did it take to write?
This one went fast. I don't know. As I get older, I write a little faster. Maybe I'm getting better. But the fastest book I ever wrote was during COVID, my Rebels at Sea. That only took me like 15 months. Normally, I take about 20 months, sometimes as much as 2 years. Some of my books are much longer. My whaling book was much longer. But this book, I think I finished in 16 months. That doesn't make it any less interesting. I don't know if I'm becoming a faster writer. I know I'm a better writer than I was 10 years ago. But maybe I'm becoming faster. Maybe it's only because I have a better idea of what I want to say. Because the person I'm writing for is not you, it's me. I'm the average reader. That's the way I look at it. If I like it, hopefully other people will like it. And I'm not smart enough to game the system and know exactly what to say to get the most readers. I'm sure there's some formulaic, anyway. I don't do that. I just
write daily?
No. I mean, sometimes when I'm really going, sometimes I do. But I have never believed, listen, every writer will tell you, maybe not every, you need to write every day. Baloney. If you're a writer, you're a writer. Sometimes you have good days, sometimes you have bad days. Sometimes I go weeks without writing. I'm researching, sure. When I'm researching, I'm not writing. But even when I'm writing, there's some days I just don't feel like writing. And there are other days when I write for 12 hours straight. There's some days when I write a couple hundred words. There have been days when I've written 2,000 or 3,000 words. They're not all good. I have to go back and edit them. So I'm a very hard worker. That's not a problem. I'm motivated. I've always made my deadlines and my contracts or beaten them, so that's not a problem. But I definitely do not write every day. I take days off to just go visit museums. I putz around. I do a lot of gardening. I don't know. Bike ride.
Did you use the Boston Library for a lot of this research?
No, I didn't use the Boston Library. Maybe I got an interlibrary loan there. Most of my research, believe it or not, was done in my office, in my house, because it was so different. When I started writing books 15, 20 years ago, I had to go visit specialized libraries. When I wrote my whaling book, I spent 2 weeks on Nantucket using their library. Now, almost every major library, Google Books, historical societies, everything is digitized. For my pirate book, Black Flags, Blue Waters, I went to England for a week, and I spent a week in the National Archives. For this book, a lot of my sources are the National Archives of England. I didn't have to hop on a plane. All I had to do is use their system, search, find the document, give them $30 or $50, and they'd send me a scan of the document. So I got dozens of documents from England that formerly I would have had to fly across the pond and spend my time there, and now they're just there. I mean, I like going to visit places, but I don't like spending a lot of money doing the research because I'm trying to make a living. So the less money I spend doing research, the more I have in my pocket. But I did go to some specialized libraries in Massachusetts. There's the Phillips Library, but interlibrary loan, my local library, just 3 days ago before I flew out here, I ordered 4 books on interlibrary loan, and all of them are being sent to my little library from out of state. They've gotten me books that have been sent from libraries from Washington, from Canada, all over the place. So it is amazing, but it's a double-edged sword because as a writer of history, you can be deluged with information. So I could have spent 5 years on any one of my books writing because there's enough information. But I want to finish a book and I want to keep writing a new book. And the trick is to not let better be the enemy of good enough. And I think that goes back to Voltaire, although my PhD advisor said that to me all the time to try to get me going. And it's true. You could always make something better, but I get bored after a while and I want to work on something new. So with all of these sources, the biggest problem I have, well, I shouldn't say it's a problem because I went to school so long, I'm pretty good at researching and deciding what's important, is when to stop, when I know I have enough. Because there's always another document I could read. There's always something else. But at some point, you either get bored or you know you have the story. And I'm not an academic who spends my whole life working in one little area, although I am proud to say that a number of my books have won academic awards. So that's nice. So, any other questions?
Do we have any questions from the online audience?
Oh, I don't see any. Where's our moderator? He went for a coffee break. If there are any questions out there, you can always look at my website. It's just my name, Eric J. Dolin, EricJaydolin, and there's a way to contact me.com. There's a way to contact me through that, so you can ask me a question if you like.
So here's a question I always like to ask. What were some of your favorite books to read as a child?
Oh, here you're going to be real. My favorite books were books that Jacques Cousteau wrote. When I was a kid, I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau. I read a lot of biology books. Nature books were real big. I read, believe it or not, and this is not a lie, our dad was a physicist. I used to read Scientific American. One of the best articles I ever read was about the USS Ramapo, which measured the largest wave in open ocean. I think it recently was broken, but they had an old article about, and it was like a 120-foot wave. And I remember I read that article multiple times. My dad would get me little compilations of books about marine issues, Scientific American, and I think there was another magazine. But I didn't read comic books much. I wasn't a huge reader, but I read mostly about science. I love going to museums. I was a very serious shell collector. Conchology, I read conchological magazines. I spent a lot of time outside in nature. But I'm ruining it for everybody. You're always told, oh, the only people that are good writers are massive readers, and they write every day. I don't write every day. I didn't even think about doing this as a profession until I was in my 40s. And so go after your dreams, whatever age you are, and maybe they'll work out. But this is the best job I've ever had. It's the hardest job I've ever had. But boy, do I like not having a boss. Or I'm my own boss. I could be not a good boss, but it's it's better than having some other bosses.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Nope, we've worn you out. So anyway, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it, this last minute book talk. Thanks for anybody who's out there. I have a feeling there might be only 3 of you. I hope there are hundreds of you. And thanks for listening. And if you need to get in touch with me or you want to get in touch with me, feel free to send me an email as long as it's positive.
Thanks very much. To our online audience, we appreciate you being here, and thank you for being here. This is really
You're welcome.
Wonderful. This is
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting.
Thanks. You're welcome.